Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the first Sarmaya talk of 2026. Before we begin, a brief introduction to who we are. Sarmaya, which means collective wealth or shared wealth in Urdu, is built around the private collection of Paul Abraham, a banker, history enthusiast, and art patron, and is led by him and his partner, award-winning designer Pavitra Rajaram. Sarmaya.in was launched in 2015 as an online museum to make Paul's collection of historical artifacts and artistic traditions accessible to public. But in 2017, it was formalized as Sarmaya Arts Foundation and was established to extend the work on ground in the form of exhibitions, workshops, outreach programs. And in late 2024, we moved into our new home, where you are all today, a public-facing archive and an engagement space. Our commitment to sharing knowledge and research continues through various programs, like the exhibition that you actually see around you. And one of those programs is Sarmaya Talks, which has been an active public program since 2015, and that brings authors, scholars, creative professionals to come here and share their research and their interest with our audience. So on this note, I welcome our today's speaker, Dr. Robert Ivermee. A little bit about Dr. Robert. He is a historian of British and wider European colonialism in South Asia, with a focus on the ideologies and practices of colonial rule and its environmental impact. He is an associate professor at the University of Grenoble, Alps, and the author of Glorious Failure, The Forgotten History of French Imperialism in India, which is the topic of today's presentation. Apart from many other publications, one of his well-known books was also in 2021, which is Hooghly, The Global History of a River. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Robert.
Well, thank you, first of all, for that, for the invitation to speak this evening, and for the warm welcome. Where have you gone? Come on, I can't see you. Anyway, thank you for those words of introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here as well. So thank you for coming. French imperialism in India, a forgotten history. Let's start by thinking about what that means. I think in general, when historians work in France on their country's colonial history, they predominantly work on the 19th and 20th centuries. They work on the period of what is often called France's second colonial empire. They work on places like Algeria, colonized by France from the early 19th century, perhaps on Vietnam, where the French take control in the 1850s and 60s. When the first French colonial empire is studied, so this is going back before 1815, it's usually in relation to North America, so perhaps French settlement in parts of present-day Canada, and potentially in relation to the Caribbean as well, where, of course, France had a number of lucrative sugar-producing colonies. When European colonialism in South Asia is studied by historians, it is, of course, overwhelmingly the British who are the object of attention, potentially the Portuguese at Goa as well, but the French are largely overlooked. If they are written about at all, it's usually in relation to the ascent of the British East India Company. So the French are presented as adversaries to the British, who are ultimately defeated. The French are incorporated into the story of the British East India Company's takeover. With Glorious Failure, I've tried to do something a bit different, which is to tell the story of French imperialism in India on its own terms. In the second half of the book, the relationship and the conflict with the British becomes very important, but as we will see, there's actually 90 years of French presence in South Asia before that rivalry of the British really becomes the key concern. When I wrote Glorious Failure, I was living in Paris. I had the archives of the French East India Company on my doorstep in the French National Library and the French National Archives. And so the other thing that Glorious Failure tries to do is to tell the story predominantly using those French sources. Of course, it's a book written in English, but I didn't want to rely on English sources when I was doing the research. The key ideas. The overriding argument of Glorious Failure is that France was an imperial power in South Asia over a period of 150 years between the foundation of the first French East India Company in 1664 and the downfall of Napoleon, which, as we will see towards the end of today's talk, effectively marks the end of French imperial ambitions on the subcontinent. What does it mean to say that France was an imperial power? Well, France tried to extend its power, its influence, its territory, and its revenues predominantly through the use of force, or at least through the threat of military action. And of course, over time, those attempts led to conflict with European rivals and a series of Indian powers. It's useful to start with a map. Some of you can probably identify here the 5 colonies of French India that remain in French hands right up until the 1950s. In the top right here, the colony of Chandanagar on the river Hooghly in Bengal. Further down the east coast of India, the colony of Yangon in bold. On the Tamil coast, the Coromandel coast, the colonies of Pondicherry and of Karikal. And then on the Kerala coast, we have the small French colony of Mahe. The shaded area is a little bit difficult to see here, but at the height of French colonial or imperial expansion in India in the middle of the 18th century, France is either directly controlling or exerting a large degree of influence over large parts of central and southern India, the Deccan, the Carnatic, and the Sircars that you can see on this map. So one of the things we'll try to do today is understand how this empire is expanded and then why it collapses so quickly after 1752. The story begins with the foundation of the first French East India Company in 1664. As we will see, France is a bit different to the British or the Dutch because there are actually 3 or 4 French East India Companies in total, partly or predominantly because each company fails commercially. The first company is founded on the initiative of the chief minister in France at the time, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. This is quite important. The initiative for the creation of the Compagnie des Indes comes from the French state through the figure of Colbert. When the British or Dutch East India Companies have been founded slightly earlier, at the beginning of the 17th century, the initiative has come from merchants and investors who have then encouraged their national governments to get involved, or at least to support the undertaking, not least by providing investment. In the case of France, it's the other way around, really. The state takes the initiative in founding the company, and then it tries to convince investors and merchants from around France to invest in this new undertaking. From the beginning, because of its slightly different character as a predominantly state undertaking, the French East India Company is about more than just commercial gain. It's about more than just making money. From the beginning, it's about the glory and power of France and of Louis XIV as the representative of the French state. We can talk more about the title of the book later, Glorious Failure, but this idea that from the beginning France has ambitions towards India that are more than commercial is an important one to discuss in further detail. Establishing a foothold. The first voyage of the Compagnie des Indes to India arrives in 1666. Permission is secured, first of all, from the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to begin French trade in the town of Surat in northwest, not far from here, in fact, in northwest India. Permission is then secured to found the colony of Pondicherry on the Coromandel coast after France has been kicked out of a series of other short-lived occupations on that coastline. The first war between France and a European rival in India takes place only 5 years after the Compagnie des Indes arrives on the subcontinent. In the 1670s, war breaks out between the Dutch and the French in Europe. That war is fought along the coastline of India. The French briefly occupy the town of San Tome, just below Madras on the Coromandel coast. When the Dutch reclaim San Tome, the surviving French party takes refuge in the village of Pondicherry and gain permission to found a colony there. So that, in a way, is where the story of the most important French colony in India begins. In roughly at the same time, in the following decade, a trading post is opened on the river Hooghly at Chandanagar. It's only after the second war between the Dutch and the French in India, in the 1690s, that France begins to fortify Pondicherry. So the plan that you can see here is the plan to, make the French presence on that coastline more secure by building fortifications based on the latest designs of French military engineers. Pondicherry is, in many ways, a strange place for the French to base themselves. It's a place that has no natural harbour. It has a climate that Europeans find very challenging. The main attraction of that part of the coast for the French is the local textile trade. And from the beginning, it's textiles that are predominantly being put on French ships and taken back to Europe from Pondicherry. The first Compagnie des Indes is a commercial failure. Its commercial privileges are suspended just before the end of its 50-year monopoly on French trade with India. In the following decade, in 1719, it is replaced by a second French company, which is in turn granted a monopoly on trade. Interestingly, this second company is founded not by a Frenchman, but in fact by a Scottish economist by the name of John Law, who has been recruited by the French state to modernize the management of the French government's finances, to create a more dynamic economy in which investment can be raised more easily, and to relaunch French overseas trade. John Law is quite an innovative figure. He tries to demonetize the French economy, to reduce its reliance on reserves of gold and silver, to create and introduce a paper currency for the first time. He creates France's first national bank, which is closely modelled on the Bank of England in London. And then his other big initiative is to launch the Compagnie Perpétuelle des Indes. As we will see here, the second company proves far more commercially successful than the first. New trading posts are opened in India at Mahe and Yangon in the early 1720s. Alongside the company's trade between France and India, a particularly lucrative source of revenue for those living in Pondicherry in the 1720s and 30s is the trade between India and other sites in the Indian Ocean. So there are company officials who are raising their own funds, often in collaboration with Englishmen who are living in Madras, in fact, to launch trading ventures to other sites, whether in the Eastern Indian Ocean or indeed Western Indian Ocean, the trade between the Persian Gulf, for example. Coffee that is taken from Mocha and brought back to India is one example of a quite lucrative Indian Ocean trade that the French are involved in. By this point in time, the French have also colonized two islands that are important in the events that follow. Reunion Island, which is named the Île Bourbon by the French, and Mauritius, which is simply given the name Île-de-France. The cultivation of coffee is the main source of revenue on Mauritius. But it's a plantation economic model that relies on the importing of slaves. So when we think about the French presence in the Indian Ocean at this time, from the 1720s onwards, we need to recognize that a very important source of revenue was the trafficking of enslaved peoples. Primarily, this is slaves who are taken from the east coast of Africa or from Madagascar and put to work in Mauritius or on Reunion Island. But there are records also showing a small number of enslaved Indians being taken from Pondicherry and also transported across the Indian Ocean towards Mauritius. There are records, for example, showing that in times of scarcity or famine in southern India, some parents sold their children into slavery, and French ships then took those slaves across the ocean. I think in general, when we study European colonialism in the Indian Ocean in the 18th and 19th centuries, we have a tendency to overlook, well, first of all, slave trading, and secondly, the patterns of indentured labor that follow. If we look at this map of Pondicherry from the year 1733, we can begin to see how the colony is growing and how signs of prosperity are beginning to emerge. If you think back to the earlier plan for Pondicherry we saw dating to the start of the 18th century, the colony was much smaller. Here it has grown. There are now two sets of fortifications, one Fort Louis right in the middle, and then a second set of fortifications protecting the town that has grown up around the fort. The town is divided into two parts. So on the bottom side of this image, closest to the sea, which is the eastern edge of Pondicherry, we have what was called at the time the Ville Blanche, the White Town, primarily occupied by Europeans. On the other side of the canal that you can see running from left to right on this image, we have the Ville Noire, or Black Town, where the local, predominantly Tamil population of Pondicherry was expected to reside. We have, therefore, a kind of physical segregation with the canal cutting in half Pondicherry between these two white and black parts. Other signs of prosperity, well, perhaps the gardens that are growing up around Pondicherry, perhaps if we look closely, the plan of some of the big houses or mansions that have been constructed in quite large private gardens close to the seafront. And in the middle of the Black Town, if you look closely, the large red building that you can see here is a Jesuit church that has been opened by French Jesuits who are trying to evangelize the local population. This is one of the other important differences between French colonialism in India and the British or Dutch on the other hand. From the beginning, the French Compagnie des Indes carries missionaries on its ships. There's a close alliance between the Catholic Church and the company, not least because the company has grown out of the French state, which is in turn a Catholic state. There are two big changes that disrupt the period of relative peace and commercial prosperity at Pondicherry that we have seen through the 1720s and 1730s. The first big change is the start of conflict between France and Britain. So the War of Austrian Succession is the first European conflict that is fought between France and Britain in India as well. This war sees the English colony of Madras being besieged and occupied by the French. It sees the British trying to organize a counter-siege of Pondicherry. It's only when peace is agreed back in Europe in 1748 that Madras is returned to the English, to the dismay of the French governor in Pondicherry at this time, Joseph-François Dupleix, who argues that his compatriots in Europe don't understand the value of Madras and have given it back too easily in distant peace negotiations taking place in Paris or in London. The second big change, beginning in 1739, is that a period of political instability begins in the Carnatic province, in which Pondicherry is located. The death of the Nawab Saadut Khan leads to a power struggle between possible successors to his Nawabship. The Compagnie des Indes inaugurates a practice that will be very important in the 2 decades that follow by lending its military support to one of the contenders for the Nawabship, a guy called Chanda Sahib. And in return for this support, the French are awarded a second territory on the Coromandel coast, just south of Pondicherry, which is, of course, Karikal. It's actually at this moment in 1739 that the French also are given permission to start coining their own money at Pondicherry. So there's a reference on one of the displays at the back there, this exhibition about the history of the rupee. There's a mention of the fact that the French begin coining their own rupee, or at least their own coin, on the permission of the Nawab of Arcot. In other words, the Nawab of the Carnatic region from 1739 onwards. Ananda Rangapillai is one of the most important Indian figures in the history of Pondicherry through the 1730s, 40s, and 50s. If we have more time, we can talk about his influence later. He's a crucial intermediary between the Compagnie des Indes and the Tamil merchant community of Pondicherry, and he also acts as a de facto diplomat representing France and the company by communicating with other southern and central Indian courts. He also, very importantly for historians, kept a diary. So a diary covering a period of almost 25 years with very detailed information about events at Pondicherry and in the wider region. This is a really important resource for understanding exactly what was going on and some of the motivations behind it. The diary has been translated from the original Tamil into English and also into French for those who would like to read it. So, the main period of French imperial expansion comes during the governorship at Pondicherry of Joseph-François Dupleix, a name that may be familiar to some of you. Dupleix isn't happy, as I mentioned earlier, with the return of Madras to the British in 1748. He considers the Nawab of the Carnatic at this moment, Anwar Uddin, to be too pro-British. And for the first time, he instructs his army, the army of the Compagnie des Indes, to enter into battle with the forces of the Nawab in September 1746. This is a decisive rupture of the usual norms of, diplomacy between the French at Pondicherry and the Nawab's court at Arcot. The result is a decisive victory for the French. It's the moment when Dupleix realizes that despite its numerical inferiority, the French army possesses a strength that can allow it to fulfill the ambitions that he wants to see fulfilled. There are parallel succession struggles going on in the Deccan and the Carnatic at this moment, and Dupleix's strategy is to support, respectively, Chanda Sahib to help him into power as as Nawab of the Carnatic, and Muzaffar Jung, who is provided with military support to enable him to take control of power at Hyderabad as Nizam of the Deccan. This is a strategy that works in the first instance. So in December 1750, the Nizam of Hyderabad, Nasir Jung, is killed, and Muzaffar Jung is installed on the throne on the throne in his place, with the help of the French army. Chanda Sahib is then in turn declared Nawab of the Carnatic. The Compagnie des Indes and officials like Dupleix are very handsomely rewarded for their support for these two figures. Dupleix receives land grants, jagirs in the Mughal system in his own name. He receives a title of nobility from the new Nizam, and he is actually named Deputy Nizam, working within the Mughal system with responsibility for all of southern India from the river Krishna southwards. If we think back to the map that we saw at the beginning of the talk, the provinces of the Deccan, the Carnatic, are now, at least in some degree, either in French hands or have had rulers sympathetic to France placed on the throne. This strategy of imperial expansion proves short-lived. From the year 1750 onwards, the British realise that they risk being expelled from the Coromandel coast if they don't support a rival contender to the throne of the Carnatic, Muhammad Ali. This is the period of the Carnatic Wars, of course, where the British back Muhammad Ali and the French continue to back their new Nawab Chanda Sahib. The decisive moment, the collapse of French power in the Carnatic, comes in 1752, when French forces capitulate on the island of Sri Rangam. Chanda Sahib is captured and beheaded. Dupleix, whose strategy of imperial expansion has been broadly supported by the Compagnie des Indes directors back in Paris for as long as it is successful, Dupleix withholds news of this capitulation at Sri Rangam for about a year after the event. But when news finally reaches Paris, via London in fact, that French forces have been routed, Dupleix is recalled to France. Historians debate the exact motivations for why he was recalled and what would have happened had he not been recalled, so a big what if in history. But at that moment, Dupleix is sent packing back to France. He is named Nizam in the Deccan. Mustafa Young is assassinated. And for the seven years that follow, France tries to maintain a presence in the court of the Nizam at Hyderabad. New land grants are secured, including a grant over the Sirkars region on the eastern coast. But unlike the British in the decade that follow, the 1760s onwards in Bengal, unlike the British, the French never managed to secure a consistent flow of money, of revenue from the land that is in their possession. The French never realized or never managed to make empire pay for itself in a way that the British will when they take over Bengal and take over the right to collect revenue in Bengal, about 10 years later. The collapse of this fleeting French empire in India is completed during the next global conflict to erupt between Britain and France, which many of you will be aware is the 7 Years' War. The French are first expelled from Bengal when the British capture Chandanagar in March 1757. They then claim control of the Sirkars region and finally occupy Pondicherry and the remaining French colonies in India in December 1760 and January 1761. Now, in some respects, we could stop the history of French India here at the moment in 1761 when French control of large parts of central and southern India has collapsed. But for me, it's possibly what follows in the final 4 decades of the 18th century that is even more interesting. Let's have a look. When peace is agreed at the end of the 7 Years' War with the Treaty of Paris, the 5 small French colonies that we mentioned earlier are restored to France. So Pondicherry, Karikal, Yangon Mahe, and Chandanagar. But France now has a question to answer. What should it do with these 5 small territories that are dotted around the Indian coastline? Some figures argue that these territories are essentially worthless and that France should abandon India altogether. There's quite a strong current of anti-colonial thought in France at this time. There are emerging writers and philosophers like Denis Diderot or Voltaire who are quite critical of the actions of the Compagnie des Indes and quite critical of the actions of Europeans in the extra-European world, more generally. It's in France in the 1750s and 60s that we begin to see the emergence of a quite modern criticism of the fundamental injustice of colonialism. In France at this time, there are also economists, quite influential economists who shape government policy, who essentially argue that international trade adds nothing to the wealth of the country. They want to see a return to an economic model that is based primarily on land and on agriculture. There is criticism of the Compagnie des Indes monopoly, and one of the things that critics of the company succeed in realizing is that the privileges of the company, its monopoly rights between French trade with India, are suspended. So when France reoccupies the 5 colonies in India in 1765, a period of free trade is inaugurated. The company limps on as one of the enterprises involved in that trade for a few more years before being wound up entirely in the year 1770. There's one other important idea coming out of France at this time, which is that France must avenge its defeat in the 7 Years' War, that France must take revenge on Britain because the Treaty of Paris has been catastrophic for French imperial interests, not just in India, but in most parts of the world. France has lost control of all of its territories in North America at this time. It's briefly seen itself dispossessed of its colonies in the Caribbean as well. So some figures in the French government, like the guy that you can see here, Étienne François de Choiseul, begin plotting a new global conflict against Britain almost as soon as the ink is dry on the Treaty of Paris, and they envisage that India will be one of the sites, one of the theatres of a new conflict, a new war, to recover or to avenge the defeat of 1763. What about Frenchmen on the ground in India? It's clear that for some, like the French governor at Chandernagore, a guy called Jean-Baptiste Chevalier, it's clear that the defeat of 1763 is a humiliation. If we wind the clock back 10 years to 1755, the French and British in Bengal are essentially equals. Both countries have a trading post on the river Hooghly. Both have to follow the laws imposed by the Nawab of Bengal at the time. If we jump forward to 1765, we have an entirely different situation where the British have installed a Nawab of their choosing in power, where the British have taken over the right of collecting the province's revenues, and where the French are in such a state of inferiority that they're no longer even able to trade freely on the River Hooghly without the British disrupting their trading efforts, blocking ships, searching ships, and so on. The conclusion of Jean-Baptiste Chevalier is that we are reduced to the most humiliating state of slavery by the Treaty of Paris and the way that the East India Company, the British East India Company, is taking advantage of its newfound position of dominance. So what does Chevalier do? Well, basically, he too begins formulating plans for a new conflict that will see the British expelled from their dominant position in Bengal, ideally removed from the province altogether. Chevalier begins contacting the different Indian powers who have seen their position reduced, who have seen themselves defeated by the British over the preceding decade. He writes to The Maratha courts at Nagpur and Gwalior. The Marathas at this time are perhaps the most powerful Indian military power. He wants to incorporate them into a new anti-British coalition. Chevalier also contacts the Nawab of Oud, Shuja-ud-Dawla. He has in Oud a Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Joseph Gentil, who has taken service with the Nawab after the fall of Chandernagore in 1757. In the years that follow, French soldiers who have been forced by the collapse of French power in Bengal to find a new employer are quite an important resource for Chevalier. Dotted around different Indian courts in the north of the country are mercenaries like the other guy that you can see here, René Madec, who Chevalier tries to convince to act not only for their personal gain, but in a patriotic way for the interests of France. Chevalier convinces Madec to abandon the Yat and Rohilla courts that he is serving in the area around Delhi, and instead to approach the incumbent Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II, to get Shah Alam on board in a new anti-British coalition. What's really interesting about these attempts to form a new coalition is the way in which they are framed. Chevalier argues that the French have a responsibility, or a duty, if you like, to help the people of Bengal and to help the dispossessed rulers of northern India to recover their position and to expel the British. I describe this inglorious failure as the emergence of a new rhetoric of liberation. The idea that France could act in a military and an imperialist way in India, not only for its personal, its national gain, but in some sort of way that is framed as being benevolent. Chevalier argues that the English are incredibly unpopular, but not only that, he argues that France has a responsibility to help the people and the princes of India, as he calls it, to secure their freedom. For me, this is one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest, application of this rhetoric of liberation anywhere in the world. We have an idea, an abstract idea like freedom, that is being applied not to criticize a colonial or imperial venture, but actually to argue that new imperialist ventures are required. This is a powerful idea that takes root back in France as well, in publications from about the year 1770 onwards. The idea that India is suffering under British domination and that France must help India to secure its freedom is reproduced in books like the Histoire philosophique et politique, which are usually collaboratively written by different writers and thinkers of the French Enlightenment. A few years later, of course, this idea that France must help people who are suffering under British rule to free themselves would be applied to America as well, when France intervenes in America's War of Independence from 1776. Before we get to the War of American Independence, let's have a look at two alliances that France forms in this period that do, at least on paper, have more encouraging prospects. In 1771 and 72, treaties are signed with the two most powerful Maratha courts. So that's at Pune and in Gwalior. But the figures who have travelled to those courts to negotiate those treaties are disappointed when the treaties are sent back to France but never ratified, never signed off by the French government back in Versailles. The other alliance, which maybe some of you have heard a little bit more about, is an alliance with the Kingdom of Mysore. France begins sending small numbers of soldiers and weapons to Mysore from the year 1770 onwards. This is just after the conclusion of the first war between Hyder Ali and the British, the first Anglo-Mysore War. And over the 10 years that follow, there is a steady trickle of soldiers, weapons, military engineers, and other technological innovations that find their way from France to Seringapatam, Hyder's capital. One of the contradictions of French policy at this time, as France is trying to plan for a new conflict against the British, is that the treaties are agreed simultaneously with Mysore and with the Maratha courts. And as many of you might be aware, these two powers don't get on very well with each other. The idea of helping the Kingdom of Mysore in its conflicts with the British culminates in the Battle of Polillier in 1780, when, as you might be aware, a serious defeat is inflicted on the British by Hyder Ali's forces. If we look closely at this fresco, which was later painted in the summer palace of Tipu Sultan at Seringapatam, we can see in the top right a small group of French artillery officers who are supporting Hyder Ali's advance and surrounding of the British army, which will lead to the routing of the British. The fresco is long; it's probably about 10 meters long in the Darya Daulat. So what we have here is just one very small detail from it. The context for this battle is the Second Anglo-Mysore War, which takes place alongside the War of American Independence. There is a brief moment in the year 1780 when the British in India are at war simultaneously with the Marathas, with Mysore, and with the Nizam of Hyderabad. The British are simultaneously on a global scale at war with France. So this is notably in North America because of France's support for the American patriots. So there is a moment in the year 1780, 1781, where the British position in India is very vulnerable, and where, with their two countries at war, France has a possibility of sending a large naval or terrestrial force to India to fight the British. But the priority for France at this time is to secure the independence of America. India is only thought of once it's clear that America will obtain its independence from the British, and by the time that large forces are sent to India by the government back in Versailles, it's too late, basically. It's only in the early months of 1783 that a large French army arrives on the Coromandel coast. This is just a couple of months before the War of American Independence and the conflict between Britain and France that it has provoked comes to an end. So that very little fighting actually takes place before a ceasefire is called, and then a treaty is signed bringing the American War of Independence to a close. Tipu Sultan, whose battle with the British continues after the securing of American independence, considers the conclusion of peace between France and Great Britain in 1783 to be an act of betrayal, basically. He sees this as an example of France prioritizing its national interests over his own interests, and effectively of France breaking its promises to help the Kingdom of Mysore to defeat the British. Tipu's response is to make one final big attempt to get more significant military and economic collaboration from France. He does this by sending what I think is the first official embassy of an Indian court to Europe. Tipu sends 3 ambassadors who set sail from Mangalore, who make a stop off in Mauritius, and then arrive in the south of France, the port of Toulon, in the early months of 1788. One of the 3 ambassadors involved in this voyage wrote an account of his travels, so it's interesting to read exactly what he says about the French journey about their journey up through France, from the port of Toulon in the south, through the Alps, the city of Grenoble, where I'm based, and then up to Paris, and then an audience with Louis XVI, King of France, in the Palace of Versailles. The response of Louis XVI to this request for a more significant alliance between France and Mysore goes unanswered. The response is non-committal, and at any rate, it wouldn't have made a huge amount of difference because, as many of you will be aware, just a few months after this embassy has taken place, the French Revolution breaks out, the monarchy is suspended and then overthrown, and any attempts of an alliance between Tipu and Louis are very much at an end. I'll finish just by briefly talking about the events of the French Revolution. There's lots that could be said here. For now, let's just make a note that when news of this revolution taking place in France reaches Pondicherry in February 1790, the events are set in motion by which the different territories of French India have revolutions of their own, basically. In each colony, a representative committee is founded, which begins to share power with the royally appointed governor. A series of representatives are sent from French India back to France, where they take seats in the new National Assembly that has been created. This is an exercise in creating a more representative or democratic form of government in France and in French India. But when we look at the details, we see that the supposed universalism, the supposed representative principle on which these changes are being installed, is actually very limited. Only a very small proportion of the residents of Pondicherry, for example, are recognized as citizens in this new political regime that the revolution sees created. To be recognized as a French citizen living in Pondicherry, you need to be a man, you need to own a certain amount of property, you need to be able to trace your ancestry on the male side to France, either in your parents' or your grandparents' generation. The idea of recognizing women in Pondicherry as citizens is at no point discussed. When the Indian population of Pondicherry requests recognition as French citizens, that request is very quickly turned down. When the Indo-Portuguese population within Pondicherry, there is a significant number of people who trace their ancestry both to India and to Portugal. They're not recognized as citizens either. In other words, there is a very big gap between the rhetoric of the revolution, the idea of freedom, the idea of representative governments, and the idea of equality. There's a very big gap between that rhetoric and the reality of the political system that is put in place in Pondicherry and the other colonies. It's only 4 years into the revolution that the practice of exporting slaves from the Coromandel coast to other parts of the Indian Ocean is halted as well. So something that we might want to talk about in more detail later is this clash between universalist or humanist principles on the one hand and the continued practice of keeping and trading slaves. The years following the revolution see the final French plans being formulated for an invasion of India. Napoleon invades Egypt, of course, in the year 1798. He envisages this to be a precursor for an advance on India. From the borders of the Red Sea, Napoleon writes to Tipu Sultan saying that he is on his way, basically. And we see the same rhetoric of liberation being deployed here. We are coming to release and relieve you from the iron yoke of England. If anything, the revolution gives a new lease of life to this rhetoric that France must act to spread the principle of liberty and engage itself in wars of liberation in India and elsewhere. The letter that Napoleon sends to Tipu never actually reaches Seringapatam. It's intercepted by the British. It's actually used as one of the pretexts for a British attack on Seringapatam that culminates in May 1799 with the fall of the Mysore capital and Tipu's death. At that point, the final major threat to British domination in southern India is, of course, extinguished. This doesn't stop Napoleon from formulating a couple of final plans for an invasion of India. In 1807, he agrees a treaty with the Shah of Persia, which he hopes will allow for the movement of French troops across Persia and into India across land. A plan is also formulated for a maritime campaign to India, but put on hold after the catastrophic defeat that the French Navy suffers in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Any remaining imperial hopes that France has in the Indian Ocean are then finally extinguished when the British capture the islands of Mauritius and Reunion in the year 1810. This marks the collapse of any French territorial control of Indian Ocean sites. The final chapter of Glorious Failure, and this is where I will finish. The final chapter of Glorious Failure considers the fate of the 5 colonies of French India in the years that follow 1815. These 5 colonies remain French right through until the 1950s, and it's only with significant reluctance that France cedes these colonies to the Republic of India in 1856 in the case of Chandanagar, and formally only in 1954 in the case of Chandanagar, and in 1962 in the case of the other 4 colonies. We can maybe talk more about the process of the end, the decolonization of French India, when we come to questions in a minute. One of the other things that this final chapter does is to think about how historiography, so the writing of history about French imperialism, has changed over time. In the 19th century, Dupleix's reputation was rehabilitated. Dupleix is actually celebrated in late 19th century France as the example of what a good French imperialist can be. There are statues of Dupleix erected in Pondicherry, as you can see here, but also in Paris and in his hometown in the north of France. There is a metro station named after Dupleix at this time in about the year 1900. The idea is to inspire a new generation of French colonial administrators who are active at this time, in places like Vietnam and Algeria. Pondicherry actually becomes quite strategically important as a stopping post for French ships on their way to Vietnam and Cambodia after the French annexation of those territories in the 1860s. So it continues to play a not insignificant role in the growth and the maintenance of France's second colonial empire of the 19th and 20th centuries. But yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Robert. The floor is now open for questions. Please raise your hands.
Can you go back to the slide where the shaded areas of Sarkar and Karnataka?
Sorry, which one?
The first one.
Right back to the beginning. Oops. Oh.
This one, okay.
The map.
Map.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So basically around 1757, which I remember in school history, we studied the Battle of Plassey. That is the time that the French kind of find themselves losing ground as British gets more aggressive. And just to give you a historical perspective, so the west coast was already occupied by the British, so they had to come to the east coast. Is that it?
1757 is definitely a decisive moment. The fall of Chandernagore to the British in March 1757 is followed 3 months later by the Battle of Plassey, and of course the installation of a compliant Nawab on the throne in Bengal. And at no point after that does France manage to recover its a position of parity with the British in Bengal. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 actually prevents France from stationing any soldiers in Chandernagore in the years that follow. France is forbidden from fortifying Chandernagore, and these are other signs that from that moment onwards, France's position in Bengal will be one of inferiority. And the question about the east and west coasts, could you elaborate?
The fact that the entire coastline has, considering France is on the west, they had to circumvent the entire peninsula and reach the other side. So that means the dominance of the British stronghold was already there.
I think it's, in the first instance, it's the presence of the Portuguese at Goa that means that the French have to look elsewhere. So the Portuguese colony at Goa has been there for, at least 100 years by the time that the French arrive in the 1660s. There is a French attempt to take control of Trincomalee on the coast of Sri Lanka, Ceylon. But they are expelled from Trincomalee by the Dutch in the 1670s, and it's at that point that instead of going back towards Surat and Bombay, France decides to go up the eastern coast of India, towards San Tome and Madras in the first instance, and then to Pondicherry.
So there's turmoil in America, there's turmoil in France, and here we have colonialism and imperialism at its height in India.
Yes, I think the two big wars that I mentioned, the War of Austrian, or three actually, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and then the War of American Independence. These are very much global conflicts. They're fought in Europe, they're fought in North America, in the Caribbean, along the coastline of Africa, and in India and the Indian Ocean. These are, some of the first major global conflicts.
I won't take your time now, but there's another question I have about the citizenship which you mentioned. So later.
Yeah, maybe we could come back to that.
Why did the British Empire allow 5 small towns of French this thing? When they could have easily gone and taken them over. Was there a treaty or something? Right up to 20th century, they were allowed to exist. 5 small towns in the vast expanse of British Empire. What was the reason?
Those 5 small colonies are returned to France in 1814. So the treaty that marks the end of the wars of the Revolution, basically, between Britain and France. I guess Britain considers by that point that they represent no threat. But the stipulation of 1763 that France can't fortify Chandernagore or station soldiers there, that stipulation is extended to cover all of the 5 colonies of French India from 1814 onwards. So these colonies are allowed by Britain to survive as trading posts. But France has no possibility of using them as military bases, I suppose, for any larger imperial designs.
Just another question, just taking off from what this gentleman said.
Yeah.
These were very 5 small settlements. Pondicherry was a little larger, but was it, was the administration of these territories, the running of the day-to-day, whatever, administration, etc., was it economically viable for France? How did they manage that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the kind of finances of 19th and 20th century French India, there is, taxes are collected. You know, there is a French colonial government in place. Taxes are collected. Historians have studied and tried to calculate how much of those taxes are spent in places like Pondicherry and how much are actually taken back to France. There is a small but nonetheless significant drain of money from the 5 colonies of French India to France in the 19th and 20th centuries. So yeah, I think the colonies do pay for themselves, and they create a surplus that can be taken back to the motherland, if you like. And yeah, as I mentioned, the colonies continue to have some sort of strategic importance simply as places where French ships can stop on their way towards Southeast Asia. That is quite important. It's very clear that France is reluctant to hand over the colonies to the Republic of India in the 1950s, and is only forced to do so effectively through some very strong kind of muscular diplomacy on India's part, which suggests, you know, of course, that right up until that date there was considered to be some value to hanging on to those places, even if they were, you know, pretty smaller, as you say.
France was into slave trade. So where were these slaves being sold? That's my first question. My second question is whether French into conversions in Pondicherry, whether trying to convert people to Islam.
Yeah. The second question is easy to answer, so maybe let's take that first. There are 2 Catholic churches in Pondicherry throughout this period. There is a Capuchin church that is supposed to be there simply to cater to Europeans, to look after their religious needs, if you like. But then there's the Jesuit church, which is responsible for evangelizing. So there are Jesuit missionaries going out into the Tamil countryside. They're traveling as far south as places like Madurai, where they're usually greeted with, indifference or hostility. One good thing about missionaries is that they often write accounts of their travels. We can study, we can read accounts of, you know, where they went, how they were received. They're usually lamenting the very small number of conversions that they are able to make. But then in Pondicherry, they're establishing they're establishing schools and hospitals as well. So the missionaries have a wider kind of social and cultural influence. They're translating the Bible into, you know, local languages. They're responsible for some of the earliest printing of texts in Tamil in Pondicherry. So they have an influence that goes beyond the small number of conversions that they're able to make. Yeah, the question about slavery. Of course, the history of European slave trading in the Atlantic Ocean has been far more widely studied and is more widely understood. I think in general, European slave trading in the Indian Ocean is understudied. There's been one good book on the subject recently, but in general, studies are few and far between. The main route of slave trafficking, as I mentioned earlier, slaves being taken from the eastern coast of Africa and from Madagascar and made to work on plantations in Mauritius and on Reunion Island. That the numbers involved grow from 1710, when that traffic begins, right through to the 1790s, the time of revolution. In addition to that, there are records of slaves being exported from India, of people being enslaved, or of slaves being purchased in slave markets in Pondicherry and Karikal, and then being taken to Mauritius as well. In some instances, there are even records of enslaved Indians being taken across the Indian Ocean and then across the Atlantic Ocean as well. So even in an age before indenture, we have small numbers of enslaved Indians arriving in French colonies in the Caribbean.
And sold in America also, across Atlantic?
Yeah, I guess the journeys that are known date to the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, so a period after most French territories in North America have been lost. So I think particularly to the Caribbean, to colonies like Saint Dominique with our, sugar plantation colonies.
The intent, I think, at two different periods of freeing India from British domination, that which of course wasn't followed through, but how does that play out in your view in in the continuance of holding on to the 5 small towns, and also the intent at those periods of time, was it about freeing those places from British dominance to replace it with, say, a friendlier and softer French presence, or was it about simply freeing them, in your view?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's a kind of ambiguity in a lot of the French writings about the need to liberate India. I think when that rhetoric of liberation emerges, the idea is that India should be restored to its, rightful local rulers. That's an idea that is very popular in the writings of somebody like Denis Diderot. Over time, there's a kind of slipping, a kind of mission creep, I suppose, to use a modern term, and we begin to see the suggestion that maybe the despotic British administration in India could be replaced by a more benevolent, well-intentioned French administration. We see the first, as far as I can tell, the first signs of that kind of rhetoric, and in an important text called Indian Politics, La Politique indienne, in the original French, published in 1768 by one Enlightenment thinker, who basically argues that the result of a war of liberation in India shouldn't just be delivering the people of India their freedom, but installing some kind of enlightened French government in the place of that. And that idea becomes much more popular and more powerful at the time of the revolution, when, of course, France begins trying to export the supposed benefits of republican revolutionary governments around the world, across Europe and around the world.
There's no conflict seen between that idea of freedom in France and freedom in other places looking very different.
Is there a conflict? I think one of the interesting things about the idea of freedom or liberty as it develops in France in the final decades of the 18th century is that the more the idea is spoken about, the more exceptions to it are created. Exceptions on the basis of race or skin color, exceptions on the basis of gender, exceptions on the basis of nationality. Some historians have even argued that the rise of this kind of rhetoric of equality and liberty goes hand in hand with more racism rather than less, as those exceptions are created and then codified when constitutions are written.
In terms of assimilation of, say, Goa, which was a Portuguese territory, and the French territories, there was a lot of resistance from the Goans who wanted to be liberated. So, like, my uncle was part of that movement, and he moved to France. So, I mean, he actually fled to France. So, was there some similar identification from the citizens, I won't say citizens, the local people of these areas when the takeover, the handover happened?
When the handover takes place, so 1754 in the case of Chandanagar, and slightly later in the case of Pondicherry and the other territories, the residents of French India are, in theory, given a choice. So they can either choose Indian nationality or French nationality. Only about 7% of the residents of Pondicherry at this time choose to become French. We could argue that that's because they identify as Indian and they want to be part of this new Republic of India. But I think the reality is a bit more complicated. I think recent studies, and there's been some very good scholarship on the end of French India in recent years, recent studies suggest that most residents of Pondicherry didn't know that this choice between nationalities existed. They show that French administrators in Pondicherry were very worried that if a choice was presented clearly to the population of the town, too many, in their words, too many residents of Pondicherry would choose to become French and then decide to move to France. Making the choice involved being literate, fulfilling in the paperwork that was needed to take on French citizenship at the moment of independence. The paperwork had to be submitted within 6 months of the treaty of handover being signed. And so in reality, to cut the story short, in reality, for most people living in Pondicherry, there probably wasn't a meaningful choice. So, even today, there are a small number of residents of Pondicherry who continue to have French nationality, people who chose French nationality at the moment of independence, but then decided to remain in Pondicherry rather than moving to France. Pondicherry, as I'm sure you're aware, has a kind of special administrative status even today, and there remains a very large French cultural presence, through institutions like the Alliance Française, the French schools, and so on. So what am I saying? We could argue that the process of decolonizing French India isn't quite complete, I suppose.
Hi. Hi. I wanted to know what could be the major reason that French was not able to fight against the British. Was it their war strategy, or that the military and army was not as par with the British? Because clearly they were trying from multiple places across the country and they were not able to fight.
I think French actors on the ground, so representatives of the company design on the ground, have less scope to act independently without first getting sign-off from the company's directors and ministers of the crown back in France. Information, of course, travels very slowly between India and France at this time. By the time that the French government in Versailles has said yes, okay, to a certain treaty, to a certain action, it might be too late. Beyond that, the colonies of French India are less well supported, I guess, by their national governments than the colonies of the British East India Company are. I think in the case of Britain, the East India Company and its people on the ground in India can kind of act first and then ask for permission later in a way that is difficult for their French equivalents. The East India Company, the British East India Company, can act independently of the British government while also asking the British government for support when it's needed. I don't think that same dynamic is possible in the French case. And yeah, for the French government in Versailles, India is rarely the priority. So keeping hold of French colonies in the Caribbean, for example, is more important. The cause of American independence is more important, as we saw at the time of the American Independence War. I think for much of the period, Frenchmen at Pondicherry and at Chandernagore complain that their compatriots back in France don't understand the value of an Indian empire, that they have given it up too easily by failing to support it, and then are not doing enough to support the actions that are taking place on the ground to get it back, basically.
Okay, we can take 2 more questions.
Yeah, sorry. Is there a, in a way of speaking, you're talking about the Great Debacle. Is it also a big missed opportunity kind of a situation? Is there any books or anything that's been published, let's say with French, considering the fact that India was considered jewel of the British Empire and all that stuff, is there anything about missed opportunity in India? Is there any book like that or any authoritative document like that?
Are you thinking, which particular battle are you thinking about?
No, I'm not talking battles. I'm talking general. If you're looking at the 200 years of history as such, the French had to effectively move out of India. And so in a way of speaking, the British benefited from whatever it was. And these were global rivals. So is this the missed opportunity? And is there any kind of a book or anything about any thinking that happened on this, or they just ignored it and just moved on?
In the 19th and 20th centuries, there were lots of French historians writing about events in 18th century India. There were lots of French historians at that time regretting that their country had lost an empire in India, accusing the French government of failing to support Duplex and other empire builders on the ground. There is a powerful idea, yes, that an Indian empire has been lost. In French, this is referred to as the idea of land perdu, the idea that if France had acted a bit more decisively, and if the government in France had acted to support Frenchmen in India, that events could have turned out very differently. I think concretely there are perhaps two moments where France had a realistic possibility of establishing lasting control over parts of India and becoming a major imperial power on a longer term basis. The first one is in the early 1750s, before the British are fully invested in their own control of the Carnatic province. So that's at the time of the early stages of the Carnatic Wars. And then the second time, which I mentioned earlier in my presentation, is in the year 1780, when the British are simultaneously at war with the three big powers of central and southern India, the Marathas, Mysore, and Hyderabad, and simultaneously at war with France as well. If at that moment in time France had decided to prioritize India, then perhaps events would have turned out very differently. But it's one of those big what-ifs that is almost impossible to come up with a definitive answer to. Yeah.
So, it was a glorious failure of the French versus the glorious success of the British in India, not in the India, but the whole over world. So, yes, the root cause lies in the two different kingdoms. You know, the British king and the French king. The British king had a less opposition, where the French king has to all his decisions are questionable by nobles, and he has to go to the commons and all that type of thing before the revolution. So French couldn't support his man in India like the Duplex all the way, not given a free hand. Whereas British Empire gave a free hand to Robert Clive, and he could do anything what he wants. Is it the reasons lies over there?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Yeah, I think many historians would argue that when the British do give a free hand to Robert Clive, and when the British do seize power in Bengal, they are following and copying tactics that have been tried and tested by the French in southern India in the previous decade. So many of the actions of a figure like Clive, the invasions, the installing of a compliant Nawab in power, the reward of land grants both for the East India Company and for individuals like Clive himself, those are all strategies or tactics that have been tried and tested by Duplex and by the French in southern India first. I guess one of the lasting frustrations for French historians writing wistfully about this lost Indian empire in the 19th century is that they identify with some justification that the British conquest of India is founded on tactics that the French have trialed first without being able to carry to a conclusion. And that maybe brings us back to the title of the book, Glorious Failure. The idea is not to suggest that there is something innately good or glorious about imperialism. The idea is rather to suggest that French imperialism in India was carried out with this abstract idea of the glory of France in mind, and that when French imperial projects collapsed, that defeat was an emphatic one, a glorious failure, an emphatic defeat that couldn't ultimately be recovered from.
Thank you. That was the last question. We will discuss the rest of the questions later. First of all, I really want to thank Robert,
No, thank you.
so much. It was a great start for Sarmaya Talks in 2026, and we are so lucky to have you here. And the conversation was amazing, and the questions were so amazing. So thank you, everyone.